Professor, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation. My name's Ian Tiley. I'm a councillor on Clarence Valley Council. I've had over 60 years in local government. Your talk today about the global and Australian context was absolutely wonderful, but I want to pull you down to a more local context. It's the questions I have for you in three parts, and you can merge them into one, of course. What tools and measures can local councils take to reduce community emissions? And you talked about this late in your presentation. How might suitable strategies be tailored to our sector? And importantly, this is a current initiative here. What would be the essential components of a net zero community emission strategy, practice tools and insights? There you go.
Thanks, Ian. And look, that's obviously a really important question, not just for Clarence Valley, but for many councils across Australia. And in fact, many councils have made already strong action to reduce emissions, to try to also address the impacts of climate change. And so the solutions for councils are not just around reducing emissions, it's also around trying to manage or adapt to the changing flooding, the changing heat extremes and things like that. But your question was really around reducing emissions. So first of all, the important thing is to think about all of the activities that the council has control over, because there are a range of activities that the residents have that the council doesn't control, and that would be related to driving vehicles. But there are things that the council does have control over that can lead to reductions in emissions. And there is, in fact, a body supported by the Climate Council called the Cities Power Partnership. And if you search on the Cities Power Partnership component of the Climate Council website, it's got lots of advice on the way that cities can manage and reduce their electricity use. Some of which is associated with street lighting, some of that is associated with building, heating and cooling in city-controlled buildings, and some of it is related to the vehicles that are used by the council for waste collection, for rubbish, for street cleaning, and a whole range of things like that. Thinking about all those different council activities and the relative magnitude of the, if you like, emissions associated with them. But the biggest one is almost always the electricity consumption and what source has been used for that electricity, how much of it can be, first of all, reduced by energy efficiency changes and save money. And then second one would be to change the light bulbs. It's more than just screwing in light bulbs differently. It's actually to transition to LED lighting systems in street lighting, as that is a major factor in the sorts of emissions as well. Now, that was probably part one. Part two is that working with, if you like, the surrounding councils or working with councils that are already having strong actions will often help with understanding what other councils have done. And that's where also the Cities Power Partnership or working with other regional councils, because one of the biggest issues for, if you like, the councils along the New South Wales North Coast is something that I haven't talked about already, and that is the, if you like, the beach protection or coastal protection as well. That's not emission related, it's actually adaptation related, but it's also to do with building regulation and matters like that. And so, if you like, My guess is the council also has some controls on boating, and I honestly don't know what boating regulations are for the council versus the wider area. So it may well also be that boating regulations are already associated with some sorts of emissions as well and that sort of thing. But working in partnership or in collaboration with other bodies that have already, if you like, addressed some of these problems and shown, how would I say, easy wins is often a good way to progress this. And I know that in New South Wales, there are many regional communities that are taking strong action. And so I would say, look to either the Cities Power Partnership or look at your neighbouring councils as to what they're doing and how they're acting, because there are, how would I say, a number of residents and councils that have very strong sustainability and environmental action plans, as well as plans for addressing climate change.
Professor, I believe that ultimately it all comes down to local communities. How might you suggest that we get greater community engagement and take-up in this global issue?
Look, that's a really good question, because some people are, how would I say, locked into their actions and activities that they've been following from their grandparents to their parents to themselves, whether it's farmers, and they would much rather continue those sorts of activities because for many people, change is difficult, particularly if it involves something new that might mean that what you've done in the past and changing costs money. And so given the current situation with the cost of living, changing to renewable energy or changing in a council to different infrastructure or different processes may be difficult because of the costs associated. But for many things, there are already regulations being imposed by federal government, many regulations being imposed by regulation bodies, whether it's the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority or ASIC. There are many approaches that are being taken across a range of different sectors to recognise that the world and Australia are changing. Most people change their phone system from a phone that was wired to a mobile phone over the last 30 years. And that change actually happened incredibly quickly. And there is more power in almost everyone's handheld mobile phone now than there was on supercomputers 30 and 40 years ago. So these sorts of changes are happening very rapidly with new technologies and new opportunities. So there will be new opportunities, and for some entrepreneurs, they will make a bucket out of these changes. And it can be the local communities that want to do it, and there will be opportunities from wave power, solar power and other things to address climate change. And it's the councils that can do this by, how would I say, moving forward.
Thank you, Professor. I've got to get off. I'm in big trouble.
Oh.
Thank
Judith's
you.
not that powerful, is she?
No, Brian. Yes.
You've got another Ian. My name's Ian Walters, and I saw a disturbing article the other day that they found some sea sponges that maybe our baseline from Paris has already been passed and that we are in fact out of time already. Is this the case?
So I know the article that you're talking about already, and it's a really interesting article, but there are a number of major problems with it technically. But one way to think about it is that they're using sea sponges in the Caribbean, and they calibrate them only to global temperatures in the period when both global temperatures and the Caribbean temperatures were rising rapidly in the period from 1960 till 2010. So a 50-year period. But if you took any temperature, like the temperature in the Clarence region, and calibrated a tree ring or some other thermometer in the Clarence region, there is actually very little local relationship to the global temperatures in the period from 1850 and before for that region to the global temperatures at that time from 1800 to 1850. But there is a strong relationship now because all the global temperatures are being driven by increases in greenhouse gases. So calibrating Caribbean Sea sponges for the recent period when there is a strong common forcing agent to allow them or expect them to be measuring the global temperatures in 1800 to 1850 is almost certainly mistaken. And there's a series of colleagues of mine who have worked on paleoclimate temperatures as well as observed temperatures who are extremely dubious of the conditions, or the conclusions in that paper. But it's a really interesting story where there are efforts to look at global temperatures in the early 1800 period. But the important period is that period, as I showed, was actually a relatively cool period from 1600 to the late 1800s. It was relatively cool. It's sometimes called the Little Ice Age in Europe, and there was no recovery from those temperatures until human activity started to produce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not primarily from coal-fired power stations then, but primarily from land clearing and deforestation, which led to some increases in greenhouse gases. There's lots of decade-to-decade variability. It's unlikely, if we use the best instrumental-based baseline, which is 1850 to 1900, that we won't formally exceed the 20-year average temperatures until the end of the 2020 to 2040 period. But we may also exceed it, as we have done in the most recent one-year period. So it's not beyond the possibility that we will exceed the 1.5 degree baseline, and then if we can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we'll return to 1.5 degrees. But that requires much stronger action in Australia and stronger global action. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Next question from Jeff Little.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much. Just as well you can't see me. I can't see me on your... Brian, forgive me, but Ian Tiley set the precedent with a short narrative. I've worked in demand-side management since 1990, principally early on with the Bill Charters, who you'll know, is technology. I now act in retirement as a consultant to the NT government in transition to natural refrigerants. My interest is in both parts, but my question is local. West Antarctic ice sheet, East Antarctic ice sheet, Greenland ice cap, and the last interglacial period temperature about 110,000 years ago. What will happen to Yamba and the Clarence Valley?
So
We are not fish.
Really interesting question, because paleoclimate variations from the different ice cores have been large, are well related to greenhouse gas variations, not in the in the last interglacial period. That was primarily changes in Earth's orbit around the sun, but we have already substantially, dramatically increased our greenhouse gas concentrations presently and will further increase them above what they were in the last interglacial period. We have 100 parts per million CO2 and other greenhouse gases higher than the last interglacial. That means we would expect temperatures by 2100 to be substantially higher than the previous interglacial, and to have ongoing melting of Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet, both of which are likely to be completely lost with 2 degrees of global warming. And 2 degrees of global warming is pretty well locked in, and there is between 10 and 20 meters of sea level rise, not 27 centimeters, 10 and 20 meters of sea level rise associated with the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. So depending on where your house is in the Clarence Valley, or how close to the beach you are, you actually don't need to worry about that 10 to 20 meters unless you're planning your house to survive for the next 500 years, because Greenland melts slowly and the West Antarctic ice sheet melts even slower. But both of them will be doomed with more than 2 degrees of global warming. It just takes a long time for that ice to melt.
Thank you. We're all safe. Thank you.
Right, next question comes from Nicholas Rove.
Hey, can I ask a question, Judith?
Yes.
Do you only have men in your audience, or are the ladies too scared by the men to ask a question?
They're coming.
They are coming. Nicholas Reeve.
Okay, I believe you, but we've already had 3 men asking questions, and I much prefer a gender-balanced group of questioners.
Can the questioner speak up, please?
I'm not asking you to do a gender transformation now.
Just as well. Thank you, Professor. It was fascinating
I should say,
discussion.
my name is David, and please.
Oh, David, thank you. My name is Nick. I'm a guest from Grafton, U3A.
Yep.
Judith met us the other day when we were on holiday here, and what shall I say? Kidnapped us. So
Twisted
My
your
question-
arm.
my question is this. Is it possible to continue with our present economic activity while achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions necessary to keep global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees increase?
That's a really good question. And the answer is associated with a talk that Ross Garnaut, an economist, and Rod Sims gave to the National Press Club last week. It's been recorded and it's available on iView on ABC. And it talks about Australian economy transitioning rapidly and growing, because Australia has lots of opportunities to become a renewable energy and hydrogen economy superpower, that instead of using the older energy sources, that we can produce as much and more energy that Australia and the surrounding region has used and will need to power our lives and our economy, not just now, but in the future with a growing population, that we need to think about how can we produce enough energy, enough electricity, enough food, enough land and we can't make more land on this planet easily for people to live. And yes, Australia has more sunlight and more wind power and more tidal power opportunities than any other country in the world. We've got more sunlight because we're located closer to the equator and we're big. We've got lots of coastline and we're windy on the coast. So Australia has lots of opportunities, first of all, to be a renewable energy superpower, and then to use that to generate hydrogen that can then be exported to other countries. Instead of exporting coal, we can export hydrogen or ammonium. So all of these provide an enormous opportunity for Australia, and we can use it locally and generate opportunities, particularly for regional Australia, because there's more sunshine and more land and more wind in rural and regional areas. Don't listen to David Littleproud that the regional areas are full, but there is space, and there's plenty of space. We just need to work in collaboration with the traditional custodians of the land, the Indigenous peoples, to make sure that they're also party to any use of their country, to transform Australia to a renewable energy superpower. And yes, it is possible to do that, and to have, as my second last slide said, have a better and more sustainable future for all people.
Oh, thank you, Dave.
Yes, it's politics.
Yes.
Exactly. I'm going anyway.
There's a female questioner. Unless she's trans, I'm not sure.
Dr. Karoly, my name's
David.
Helen David. My name's Helen Granleys. I'm a member of Valley Watch, a local group dedicated to preserving and protecting our local environment. First of all, I'd like to compliment you on that beautiful quilt that's behind you.
Which my wife made.
Well, give her my congratulations. As a quilter, I appreciate it very much.
Yep.
What I'd like to say is, do you have a sense, given the impacts you have described, that the citizens of Yamba are getting enough help to know how to adapt our homes and lifestyle to deal with our evolving weather conditions?
There's always more information that is needed. It's clear that, there is information available, but how you search for it and how much it's available depends also on the, how would I say, politics of the region, politics of the day, and both in New South Wales and across Australia, politics has influenced the availability of information, both in Queensland, New South Wales, and across Australia over the last 30 years. And almost no one in Australia is aware that the policy of the Liberal National Party government in briefing documents provided to their cabinet wanted to have a cabinet policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the 1990s. But it was never agreed in their cabinet, and it was stopped because the lobbyists at that time wanted it stopped. So now back to your question. There is information available. You have to search. It's not readily available. And there are a whole group of the regional population that is concerned and aware. Another group that is, how would I say, cautious and concerned. And a final group that just doesn't want to know or disputes all the scientific evidence. That, how would I say, unwilling to change group, or the group that disputes all the scientific evidence, comes up with their own echo chamber, is the group that probably would support Donald Trump. And look, Donald Trump and their views are perfectly good opinions, but I prefer to base my opinions and evidence on the best available science. It is available, and there's a whole bunch of references that I've provided, and the New South Wales government is now providing lots of information at the state level and the regional level of how to adapt your house, your property, and your activities to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. But I'm not a local in your region, and so you're better to go to the local experts.
Yeah, I was thinking more in the light of adapting for cyclones coming and, you know, double glazing and really practical measures that,
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I've installed double glazing. You can do that straight away, and it's sensible because first of all, it reduces the amount of heating you need, but it also reduces the amount of air conditioning you need because it makes the thermal, how would I say, capacity of the building much better, controls the temperatures. You do have to open your windows some of the time because fresh air is also important. But yes, in terms of cyclones coming, there will be a slight projected southward shift in the paths of tropical cyclones on the east coast. Best estimate is 50 kilometers southward from the current range of tracks, not 500 kilometers. And my understanding is that there has been a long time since a tropical cyclone hit Brisbane, let alone south of the New South Wales border. It has happened in longer geological records, but there hasn't been one in the last 100 and something years based on newspaper reports and human observations. So that tracking of tropical cyclones across the sort of South Queensland and northern New South Wales is pretty good because when a tropical cyclone hits, there are people that will report it to the newspapers, even though the newspapers are quite old. You just have to go to older newspapers.
Thank you very much.
Right, next questioner is Rob Milchrist.
Good afternoon, David. My question relates to, well, we've got a climate change advisory committee on the local council, and we had a nice presentation a week or so ago about blue carbon storage. And that's just one option for ripping a bit of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But how are we going to get rid of all that other carbon dioxide that's out there?
Yeah. No, we don't want to get rid of it all. We do want some carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, partly because carbon dioxide is the food for plants. So we don't want to rip it all out. We just want to get back to essentially 350 parts per million, which is still higher than the last, what it's been for most of the last 2,000 years, which I said was 280 parts per million. But 350 parts per million was the mid-1900s. How can we get it out? Well, look, plants take it up effectively and efficiently. They're the only efficient, cheap, inexpensive capture mechanism. Marine organisms do capture carbon dioxide, whether it's seaweeds or plankton in the oceans. Most of the oil and gas from marine organisms was trapped 60 million years ago, 100 million years ago to make oil and fossil gas and then compressed. So look, we know that marine carbon capture is really important. It just doesn't happen at fast enough rate to remove the carbon dioxide that we've added very efficiently. Humans are very efficient at digging up coal, or have been very efficient at digging up coal, extracting gas and oil. What we need is fast processes. We're not sure that anything exists at the scale that's needed and the price that's available as yet. but there is a lot of research going on into what's called direct air capture, but it is not cheap. It is at least 100 times more expensive than growing plants and forests. And that means it's unpalatable for the global economy and the Australian economy. So what we need is, Mr. Dyson to invent the carbon vacuum cleaner that you plug to the wall, but no one's invented that yet. And at present, as I said, the only efficient system is to plant more trees. Carbon capture and storage is also being tested as chemical processes, and there are also mineral processes on land. But there isn't enough land to plant enough trees to remove the carbon dioxide at the scale that I talked about. 10 billion tonnes a year is required, and we just don't have the capacity to do that at present. There are rapid developments going on in this space. If it's good enough, fast enough, cheap enough, it may be possible to use this. But the first thing we have to do is to shift away from using fossil fuels in our lifestyles, in our economy, and in our businesses. Go to something that is renewable and provides electricity.
Thanks very much for that.
Right, next questioner is Harry Johnston.
Hello, David. Thanks for your talk. I've been interested in waste minimisation for a long time, the minimisation of resources, as well as people who want to be useful. Population Matters, as the spokesperson for Population Matters says that global population does matter. I'd like you to sort of speak along the lines of what its effect is on climate change and why, if it does matter, there's so little mention of population.
So let's talk about the second part first, which is why there's so little discussion on it. And it's primarily cultural and religious perspectives. And politics tends not to get involved in both cultural and religious perspectives. It causes wars in the Middle East, and it causes wars in Ireland and many other parts of the world. So let's try to avoid the politics. But your question is a really, really important question, because yes, population does matter. And what we've seen as the population has grown is a dramatic growth in emissions. And there are two factors that have led to the increase in greenhouse gas emissions over the 20th century. And the one factor is the population growth from around 1 to 2 billion people at the beginning of the 20th century to now more than 7 billion people, now 8 billion people all around the world. And that's a factor of 4 or 8 growth, depending on where you start from. And I have forgotten whether it's 1 billion people at the start of the century or 2. But look, there's been a large growth. However, the growth in emissions is much, much bigger than that. Emissions in total and emissions per person. What we know is that it's the emissions per person that's critically important, not just the total population. The total population and the population growth is very, very important, but it's not the sole answer, and it's not as big an answer as the emissions per person. And the emissions per person is how much carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions there are associated with agriculture, with transport, and your electricity generation. And unfortunately, Australia's per person greenhouse gas emissions are higher than any other developed country in the world. They're higher per person than the United States. They're higher per person than any other developed country in the world. They're about double China's per person emissions of greenhouse gases, and they're nearly 5 times the global average per person emissions. Per person emissions are about 2 tons per person. So Australians are emitting dramatically more than their fair share of global emissions. And that can be seen by looking at, if you like, Australia's share of the population versus Australia's share of emissions. And I won't go through that, but Australia is about 5 times or more higher than the average across the globe. So look, what we've got to recognise is, yes, population is important, but Australia's population is going to be critically important in Australia's emission growth, as well as population growth in any region around the world. But it's population growth in developed countries. Developed countries are the major contributors because they've got the highest energy consumption. So yes, we need to limit population, but even more important is limiting the sources of emissions so that we can essentially reduce per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. That's been happening in Australia, associated with the reductions in fossil fuel use in coal-fired power stations, but it hasn't been happening in Australia for all the other sources like transport, like agriculture and other sectors, as I showed in that table with all the numbers associated with the different sectors. So Australia needs to think about emission reductions across all sectors, not try to control population in China or in India, but provide solutions for energy, other energy sources, about exporting fossil fuels, but actually to export other renewable energy, either through hydrogen or other sources. And then Australia, as I said before, can become a renewable energy superpower.
Thanks very much, David.
The next question comes from Ronnie Lopez.
Thank you, David. My question is about the IPCC formation. When that happened, I realised there were a lot of reasons for it to happen, but what made it happen? And was it the influence of the Club of Rome?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I can provide a factually accurate answer, but let me backtrack a little bit. 1988, there was already a number of substantial scientific papers that were showing that increases in greenhouse gases were likely to increase global average temperature, but there was no convincing evidence that showed that they were already driving increases in global average temperature. But projections and studies were saying, well, it's going to happen. There are a number of papers, even before the Second World War, paper by Guy Callender, that argued that increases in greenhouse gases were going to lead to major global warming. Arrhenius, late 1800s, had a study that said that increases in greenhouse gases were going to lead to more than doubling of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere due to burning of coal. Not oil and fossil gas, but coal, because that was all that was around. And his estimate was that it would take more than 500 years for doubling of carbon dioxide concentrations, and it would lead to around 2 to 3 degrees of global warming. The only thing he got wrong wasn't the magnitude, for doubling of carbon dioxide. It was the speed at which we dug it up. So, Club of Rome, it was talking about major catastrophes and growth and decline, but its major emphasis wasn't on temperature. It was on a range of factors, processes in the environment that would lead to collapse of the environment. However, the IPCC was set up because governments around the world, particularly more the developed world governments, were starting to recognize that the concerns around climate change, and particularly the warming since the Second World War, were indicating and consistent with the projections earlier on that increases in greenhouse gases were likely to lead to ongoing increases in global temperature. So the scientists were lobbying their governments. Governments decided, well, we better set up a United Nations body. And so the United Nations body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is made up of representatives of the governments. And those governments individually approve unanimously the reports, and they have to approve them unanimously. Now, that process had not been set up. It's like a United Nations process where motions in the United Nations require unanimous support, unless it's the Security Council where there are some veto powers. And it turns out that even with the IPCC, 1 or 2 countries who provide convincing evidence to convince the scientists, experts, they can veto any statement or report if they wish. However, they would then be standing up against all the other 150 countries. And there's a lot of lobbying that goes on in these plenary meetings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I've been involved in some of those plenary meetings to show that there are some, how would I say, efforts to veto things that usually don't stand up. So look, that's more than enough answer to your question. It didn't have a direct link to the Club of Rome, but more a direct link to the scientific evidence at the time that was starting to be getting stronger and stronger. I should add, I published my first paper that showed convincing evidence that increases in greenhouse gases were already affecting changes in global temperatures using what is described as a fingerprint approach, a fingerprint of changes in the temperatures in the lower atmosphere and temperatures above the tropopause layer or into the stratosphere. And those temperatures are expected to cool in the stratosphere due to increases in greenhouse gases and warm in the lower atmosphere. My paper, first paper on that, was published in 1987.
Okay.
That's 35 years ago, and the evidence has just got stronger and stronger.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you. One other question. How do we combat? We've got a property where we plant a lot of trees. There are a lot of other people trying to do the same thing. But the planning laws in New South Wales now allow clearing of trees and without any permission. What do you do to change that? Is there a solution other than the government being persuaded?
Well, look, the government is determined usually by the majority of votes. So you just need to lobby hard and get more votes. But land clearing is still a major factor. As I showed, the net benefits from land use change and land clearing is in Australia for more forestry. But in New South Wales, there is, as you said, very significant land clearing that is contributing to increased greenhouse gases emissions. And what should be done, both in New South Wales and in Queensland, is stopping the clearing of, old growth native forests, but also stopping the clearing of new forest growth so that it can grow to full size. But there is actually, if you cut down trees and store the carbon and then plant more trees, opportunities for what is called carbon capture and storage, particularly if you put those trees that you've cut down into an old coal mine and store it underground. Because there is plenty of old coal mines in parts of New South Wales that could be reforested and then the trees planted or buried inside the old coal mines. There are always
Yeah.
also something
Carbon
called
capture.
carbon capture, but also BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, which is using wood from the trees to power stations and then capturing the carbon dioxide and storing that underground as well. So look, there are opportunities, but you're right. Stopping land clearing or stopping cutting down trees, particularly old growth forests, is critically important.
Thank you.
Final question from Helen Tias-Tungul.
Oh, beautifully said.
Hi, David. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm an environmental educator that's been involved with Valley Watch for over 30 years. And you've partly answered my question because I think it was fairly obvious to the other Helen, Helen's question. Given that, you know, last century in the 1990s, our New South Wales government agencies were hosting seminars locally in Grafton and giving a lot of information about climate change, the predictions about the negative effects, what was going to happen, also suggestions about what we should be doing. And there was a lot of information and there were a lot of people that were keen to follow up and get on board. In fact, before amalgamation of our local council, the previous Maclean Shire Council hosted the first Australian Global Warming Conference in this very building in August 1997. Now, what has happened as far as community understanding, as you know, government initiatives at every level, we've gone backwards. And no blaming any particular thing, although the politics is obvious, but surely it's more. And is this a general trend across the whole of Australia, or is it just us here in the Clarence?
So all I can do is report to you in terms of across Australia, the results from polling, and that is that climate change and its impacts on the environment is one of the highest, polled issues that's important. And in some sense, the best evidence of that is the results of the national election, the most recent one in 2023 that led to a change in government, change in national government, and quite substantial change in government, but also the election of a lot of candidates that were essentially the independents or teals. And so that led to a significant change. I mean, my comment had been that a vote for the Labor Party or a vote for the Liberal National Party coalition, both of those were votes for making global warming worse, because the climate change policies in both of those sets of candidates for the election, the policies of both parties were that they wanted to continue fossil fuel use and they wanted to continue export of coal and natural gas. Look, politics is an important issue. There has been major change. I don't know how much there has been change in your region specifically, but I think that you'll find, both this activity and talking to the councils, that there has been substantial community action. You just need to talk more widely and get involved in some of the activities. And you're doing that as an environmental educator. I think you'll find that there is now broad community endorsement of the sorts of actions and activities that you're involved with, and I strongly support you in those activities.
Thank you very much.
I've got to answer a question that I put to the audience.
The fish, the fish.
Why are most people not fish? Why is that relevant to climate change?
Because we can't breathe in the water.
No. No. You're right. That is a very good answer, but that's not the answer. Why most people are not fish is relevant to climate change. So I talked about this quite a bit, but you didn't think I was talking about it at all. I said that the Australian average temperature is about 40% higher than the global average. I talked about the global land temperature was also higher than the global average. The global average temperature is the average of the ocean surface temperatures or sea surface temperatures, which are less than the global average. And the land temperatures, not only in Australia, but on all land, except maybe the Arctic and the Antarctic, is higher, warming up faster. And you know that every time you go to the beach, you know that in the Clarence Valley, you know that the closer you get to the beach, to the coast, there's less warming from winter to summer, less warming from day to night. The nighttime temperatures are cooler in the land and hotter on the land in the middle of the day, particularly in summer. So if you go inland, you go over the divide to the inland area, it's much, much hotter. So same thing applies to global average temperature. There's about 40% higher warming on land than the global average and about 30% less warming on the oceans compared to the global average. So why is that important? Well, why don't we talk about global land average temperatures in terms of setting a target? Because it's about 40 to 50% higher, and the politicians don't want to know about higher numbers. So for reasons that are, have you ever heard of a politician talk about the global land average temperature or the Australian average temperature, which is significantly hotter than the 1.5 degree target? Because 1.5 degrees is more than 2 degrees warming averaged across Australia. And for 1.5 degrees of global warming, we will have 3-4 degrees of warming in inland areas, in Broken Hill, in Mount Isa, places like that. Alice Springs is already getting close to 50-degree temperatures in the shade, not in the sun, in a well-ventilated environment. We will get, for 1.5 degrees of global warming in the 2030, 2040 period, we'll get 50 degrees Celsius temperatures in the shade, not in the sun, in the shade, in inland areas. And there are already 50-degree temperatures, but only in the sun.
This is cold, don't be afraid, quote unquote.
Yes, exactly. We know how to address it. We know how to fix it. We've just got to try to persuade our local, state, and federal politicians that we want everyone to be involved jointly in solving these problems.
Thank you, David, very much for those insights, and I'll press the button to the sound of our applause again. Thank you. Thank you.